Welcome everyone to our event tonight about the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition of anti-Semitism. My name's Liam Gatroy. I'm the Executive Director of NIF in Australia, and I want to start our event, as we always do, by paying tribute to the traditional custodians of the land that we're all on, wherever we might be, and acknowledging that this is Aboriginal land where sovereignty was never ceded. Here in Sydney, I'm on the lands of the Gadigal people of the IHRA Nation, and I want to pay my respect to their elders past and present. Now, we've got more than 300 people joining us tonight, so thank you everyone for doing this on a Tuesday night with us for what has become a hotly debated topic both within the Jewish community and in broader politics as well. And before we get started with our panel, I thought it would be useful to add a little bit of context. And even though this discussion has been going on for many years now, it has become recently reignited in the Australian political world when last month Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, announced that his government would be adopting the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. He did that at a conference in Sweden. And the adoption has been accompanied by a number of calls, including from the Federal Education Minister, Alan Tudge, for codification and implementation. Tudge made it clear that he wanted to see it embedded within government policy and for it to cascade down, for example, into university campuses. Now, for a number of years, NIF around the world has been expressing concern about how this would play out, including in particular the possibility that reasonable and fair criticism of Israeli government policy would get wrapped up in this and illegitimately classified as anti-Semitism as part of, for example, a hate speech code on a university campus. Now, in the US Jewish community, this is hardly a novel position. NIF has stood alongside organisations like J Street, Habo, Hashi, Ameinu, Meretz, Americans for Peace Now, in objecting to the way that the definition was being used, citing its potential for misuse, and in particular concerned about the way that it was being used by the Trump administration and by Mike Pompeo's State Department, including an announcement that he made where he effectively classified organisations like Amnesty International, Oxfam and Human Rights Watch as anti-Semitic. Now, what this discussion about the details to codify and adopt and implement the definition does, a debate which is being led by a number of right-wing pro-Israel organisations around the world, what this does is it actually distracts us from the task at hand. That task, of course, is how we best combat anti-Semitism. How do we address the rise of the far right in liberal democracies like Australia and the United States? How do we become more aware of how to fight things like neo-Nazis marching through the Grampians, the kinds of anti-Semitism that we've seen in the anti-vax movement? How do we focus ourselves on fighting anti-Semitism, real, honest hatred of Jews, without getting sucked into political arguments? So during tonight's discussion, we're going to hear from three very useful perspectives to unpack this debate and understand the global context, and importantly, I think, also apply an Australian lens. So tonight's panel, we have the lead drafter of the IHRA definition, Ken Stern. Ken is director of the Bard Centre for the Study of Hate and an attorney and award-winning author. For 25 years, he was the American Jewish Committee's expert on anti-Semitism, and he's argued before the Supreme Court of the United States, testified before Congress, and for us, certainly been a very useful resource as we understand this phenomenon. Our second guest tonight is Mark Baker, who many of you will know, former director of the Australian Centre for Jewish Civilisation, a best-selling author and a member of NIF's Global International Council and our Australian Advisory Council here as well. And to offer her unique perspective on the issue, we also have Sydney University law student Nell Cohen. She's a former Bulgarian of Habonim in Sydney. She's written for student publications like On Histoire, was a 2019 Fellow of Augus's Susan Wakefield Fellowship, and is a valued member of our NIF New Gen team here in Sydney as well. And finally, helping us put together all the pieces is mediator, facilitator, and judicial educator Jo Kalowski. Between 1984 and 1988, she was Director of Community Relations and Education at the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Board, where she designed and led programs to combat racism, sexism and homophobia. And to this day, she continues to write and lecture widely on cross-cultural issues in mediation and works with courts and tribunals to ensure just treatment of unrepresented people before the courts, especially members of minority communities. So with thanks, thank you again for joining us, and I'll hand it now on to Jo.
This is a discussion on the origins of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, how it's playing out in governments and on university campuses, and most important of all, how we can best commit to opposing anti-Semitism today. Thank you, Liam, for introducing this event and these three fabulous speakers. We have a lot to talk about. I'm glad to be able to facilitate this conversation and wade through the issue with you all. Nell, Ken and Mark, welcome once more, and let's jump right in. Ken, can I begin with you? As lead drafter of the definition, what is the history of its creation? How did it come about and why?
Well, thank you for the question, and it's a pleasure to be with you all. For me, this evening, for you guys in the morning, as we're recording this. But I want to give you the background. It didn't start with IHRA. It started with actually a group called the EUMC. It's the same definition with a couple of tweaks, but it really started around 2004. And what had happened was the EUMC now is part of the Fundamental Rights Agency of the EU. But then it was tasked with looking at issues of racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and so forth. And you may recall, after the peace process collapsed, and there was the Durban Conference and the Second Intifada, there were a series of sustained attacks against Jews, particularly in Western Europe, but elsewhere too. And the EUMC put together a report that came out in 2004 that looked at the issue. And there were two major problems that it mentioned along the way in its report about what was happening on the ground. One was that you had data collectors across different parts of Europe, and they had no common definition of what to look for, what to include or what not to include in a report about anti-Semitism. So it was trying to get some sort of a standard, so you could tell across time and across borders that people were looking at the same thing and compare it. Second problem was more of a political one. It sort of said, well, okay, we'll have a sort of substitute definition to guide us at the moment. It's about stereotypes about Jews, which I had a problem with. It. To me, those are reflections of what anti-Semitism is, as opposed to its defining characteristics. But they basically said, okay, what happens if somebody on the streets of Paris or London is attacked as a stand-in for an Israeli? Is that anti-Semitism or not? And they concluded, well, if somebody had these particular attitudes and stereotypes about Jews, applied them to Israelis, and then reapplied them to the person in front of them, that would be anti-Semitism. But if they were just upset with the policy of the Israelis or something that happened there, that would not be anti-Semitism. And I'm thinking, growing up in the United States during the Civil Rights era, I immediately leaped to, well, if somebody killed a black person and strung him up in a tree in the South, and because he believed blacks were shiftless and lazy, that's racism. But if they were upset at the passage of a civil rights bill or a Martin Luther King speech, and they killed the same poor person in the same way, that's not anti-Semitism. So what happened was sort of a confluence of circumstances. The head of EUMC came to an American Jewish Committee meeting. I was on the staff of AJC at the time. And a couple of weeks beforehand, lo and behold, Israel assassinates a Hamas leader, and somebody in retaliation firebombs a Jewish school in Montreal. Thank God nobody was hurt. But according to the definition, no question, it should not be counted as anti-Semitism. So we started working with the UMC to craft a document that would do really three things. The major purpose was to provide some concrete examples for bean counters, so they would know what to include and what not to include. The second thing, and to me this is the most important one, is that you were having these debates about, is it anti-Semitism or is it not when a Jew is attacked? And you may recall there were other cases too where there was a Jew was kidnapped because Jews were rich. Well, the people were debating, is that anti-Semitism or not? That's a positive stereotype. And we really modeled after U.S. hate crime law, case that said that you really have to look at the intent, not the motive. If somebody selects somebody to be a victim of a crime because of who they are, sometimes there are cases where there are people that are non-Jews who are killed when somebody's trying to attack a Jew, as happened in the United States a few times in the last few years. Those should be counted. So that was the second purpose, to really try for hate crime training and to get a standard view of, you don't have to psychoanalyze the perpetrator of the act. You have to look at why they selected a victim. And the third thing was to try to help on a diplomatic level. There was a report that was going to be done by the U.S. State Department on anti-Semitism. We wanted it to parallel what we hoped would come out of the data collection across Europe. And we also thought it would be useful for training diplomats. When they said, what do you mean by anti-Semitism? There were things that could be pointed to. So those were really the issues. The things that are contentious, of course, are the examples about Israel. And if you want, I can delve into that now, or if you want, I can talk about it later, but there were specific reasons why those were included as well.
I think it could be interesting to lay the groundwork, Ken, if you would cover those. Obviously,
Sure.
We don't have masses of time, but it would be very interesting because one of those clear exclusions is if it's reasonable criticism as might be levelled against another country. But I'd be fascinated, and I think our audience too.
Right. Well, there were two things. One was that we wanted, as I said, to take a temperature over time and across borders. This was not to label anybody an anti-Semite. This was not to indict anybody, but it was mostly, as I said, for data collectors. So there were times, again, recall post the collapse of the peace process, where you'd see some speech, anti-Zionist speech, other speech, that was getting a huge amount in the newspapers in London, for example. And I had a colleague there who could overlay that with a chart of attacks against Jews. So it wasn't to say causation, but to take temperature over time. It was important, we thought, to have a correlation so that data collectors could see those things that might influence when you see anti-Semitic attacks. The question of comparing Israel, to other countries, and not having all criticism of Israel being anti-Semitic. Clearly, not every criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. But what we were thinking again about the time when this was created, in particular, the Durban Conference in South Africa, which was an anti-Semitic and anti-Israel orgy, had just happened a couple of years before. Clearly, picking out Israel for treatment that no other country had, and you saw Jews there being vilified with classic anti-Semitic tropes and the protocols being sold in that same time. And then also thinking about things like the UN Human Rights Commission. But it was never to say that you need to. There was another part of the definition too about about looking at criticizing Israel in the way other democracies are. It was more of thinking about things like, well, Israel gets attacked with rockets landing on it, and it responds in a way you can clearly argue about the appropriateness of the response and the proportionality of the response, but it responds. And there were people saying it shouldn't respond, and that wouldn't be the same type of situation if there were rockets coming into the United States from Mexico or Canada. Nobody would say that the U.S. shouldn't have a response. So those were the types of thoughts that entered into the definition. But again, it wasn't to label any particular person an anti-Semite or any particular expression anti-Semitic.
Thanks, Ken. Mark, what is the history of the term anti-Semitism? Is there a clear definition that we can trace that's captured by the IHRA definition?
Okay. Well, I could listen to Ken for this whole session because he was one of the framers, and I've learnt a lot already. And unlike Ken, who begins in 2005, I would have to begin at least in 2005 BCE. So how do I answer that in a short way? The short point is there is no clear definition of anti-Semitism, and I think that's really important knowledge to have in the background of how we think about the IHRA definition. Historians have been debating the meaning of anti-Semitism. For a start, it was only coined as a new word in 1879 by a German publicist, Wilhelm Marr, and it was part of the 19th century ideologies, isms, that tried to turn hatred of Jews into a political mass party. And indeed, at the end of the 19th century, for the first time, you actually had the rise of anti-Semitic political parties. Historians, though, have retroactively taken that term anti-Semitism and applied it to what is more commonly known as Judenhass, Jewish hatred, and gone as far back as our own mythological story, Megillat Esther, the Scroll of Esther, where there is a genocide planned in that book. There are different ways of understanding anti-Semitism, and I think this is what's important. There are some historians, particularly in the Israeli school, Ben Sasson was a very influential historian, who took a genealogical approach to anti-Semitism, saw it morphing in each generation, and beginning with Christian attitudes towards Jews, and taking images such as the Jew as the subterranean devil, and then applying it, for example, in the 19th, 20th century to the Jew as the Bolshevik, and many of the icons being very similar. Then there are other historians who take a more contextual approach and who would emphasize the differentiation and the context in which acts that have many of the attributes of anti-Semitism take place. So, for example, in France, would want to look in more detail about the history of the banlieue in France and the relationship between different migrant groups in France. I think the main point is that Zionism, ironically, took the view that it would solve anti-Semitism, that once a Jewish state was created, there would be no anti-Semitism. Leo Pinsky pathologized anti-Semitism and called it Judeophobia. He used psychoanalytic terms before Freud came on the scene, and his view and Herzl's view was that with the creation of Israel, anti-Semitism would disappear. In fact, what I would argue, and this is part of the issue with IHRA that I think we need to discuss, is that issues around Israel have in fact solidified a certain view of the Jew as victim. So while Israel and Zionism was about empowering Jews, in fact it has in the psyche of Jews perpetuated the very opposite of what Zionism has achieved, a powerful state, and turned Jews, or the Jewish mentality, I think almost pathologically, into a victim mentality where anti-Semitism is all too readily seen in situations, which is not to say that anti-Semitism doesn't exist and isn't a serious problem that should be addressed, but to create an orthodox, clear definition is part of the problem.
Mark, do you think, though, that there is a need for a clear definition of anti-Semitism as some sort of a guide for politicians, for police, for the media?
I don't think it's possible to get a clear definition of anti-Semitism, and I'd like to hear more what Ken and Nell's experience as well. But I think that what is important is education, and educating about stereotypes of Jews and how certain stereotypes can morph into anti-Semitism, because it's very problematic and almost impossible to simply categorize. I mean, certain things are very clearly anti-Semitism. The attack on the Etz Chaim shul in Pittsburgh is a clear act of anti-Semitism. What about the anti-vaxxers standing outside Parliament holding up images of Dan Andrews dressed as a Nazi? Is that anti-Semitism? It's using Nazi imagery. It's totally offensive. I'm not going to go into my views about the anti-vaxxer movement, but some people can use these images and manipulate them in different ways, which is why I think it's very important to look at the specifics rather than to try to come up with a catechism that clearly defines anti-Semitism, because we end up creating a rod for our own back when we do that. And we don't show nuance. And when we don't show nuance, we end up crying wolf all the time. And I think that's what's happened with the establishment Jewish community, which is not only unhealthy for the relationship we have with the media and with politicians, but I'm much more concerned about the effect that these definitions have on the Jewish psyche. You just open up the Jewish news each week, and it's page after page after page describing the most obscure anti-Semitic incidents. And again, I don't want to minimize the reality of anti-Semitism. I often fear for my life. I fear for Jews around the world who are facing real anti-Semitism. But the danger is that when we take politicians on trips to Israel, and the first stop we take them to is Yad Vashem, which is the shrine of Israel, the unconscious belly of Israel, which is currently run by a settler. And that doesn't disqualify the good work that Yad Vashem does. But I think that when we see anti-Semitism always culminating in the Holocaust, we create for ourselves a pathological attitude of our identity as victims, rather than, especially in relation to Israel, as an empowered group.
This is really fascinating. Nell, I really have to come to you because you're really our future. And the question for you is, when Jewish students talk about anti-Semitism on campus, what are they talking about?
Well, firstly, thank you for having me. Well, I would say the first thing is that the majority of Jewish students don't experience anti-Semitism on campus, at least not directly. Having said that, there is anti-Semitism on campus, and a lot of it, when I think of anti-Semitic incidences that come to mind, a lot of the time it is to do with Israel. And there's a real spectrum of what that looks like. So on the one end, which I think is the area where we're not really sure what is and isn't anti-Semitic, there is a lot of anti-Israel speech on campus, especially when violence erupts between Gaza and Israel, when Sheikh Jarrah was in the news. When those events happen, stuff on campus happens. Anti-Israel protests, articles in student media, and this can have a range of rhetoric from calling Israel an apartheid state to saying Intifada now. So that's kind of the environment on campus that isn't directed at individuals. And then you have, I'll just give an example. I know of Jewish students who live on a residential college at a university. And earlier this year, when Sheikh Jarrah and Gaza were in the news, the environment at their college became quite uncomfortable. There were incidences such as someone saying "Free Palestine" to a Jewish student for no reason, Jewish students being approached at meal times and by people they weren't friends with and arguing with them about Israel-Palestine unsolicited, being blocked from friends' Instagram stories, all the Jewish students being blocked from their friends' Instagram stories because they were going to pro-Palestine protests. So incidences like that, and also just in general, posters everywhere calling for the Intifada, especially for 18, 19, 20-year-olds, that I think was pretty confronting for them. And then you have, at the, I'd say, other end of the spectrum, I'll give a couple of years ago, a man was convicted for stabbing his neighbour. And on the witness stand, he said that he'd had plans to use the knife to go into the University of Sydney and stab any Jew he could find in the name of justice for Palestine. So, Ken, when you speak about the temperature leading to more anti-Semitic, targeted anti-Semitic incidences, I think that spectrum is a good example of where there's a lot of vitriolic speech at one end, and then small targeted incidences by students that might not realize that what they're doing is hateful or anti-Semitic. And then you have a couple of individuals once every few years who have very extreme views and have plans to act on that. And that can lead to real violence.
Nell, you're really describing really a destructive climate, that even a student who might engage in useful, comfortable debate, exactly as I hope we're doing this evening, might feel that they haven't a voice. Is that one of the effects? How do you see this playing out? Does it silence students?
Yeah, I think Jewish students, when it's in those environments, they sit in a funny place. They can either say nothing, do nothing, and generally nothing will happen to them. There will be no negativity towards them. You have groups like August, which is the only Jewish student union, who, if there is something that they believe is anti-Semitic that happens, they will release a statement and might have might clash with other student groups over that. But yeah, in my own personal experience, in 2018, when Gaza was in the news, and there were anti-Israel protests on campus, I wrote, for actually a uni assignment, a personal essay about what it means to be a left-wing Jew on a university campus and be in left-wing spaces. And for the assignment, I had pitched it at my student newspaper. And so at the end I thought, oh, I may as well pitch it. And they rejected it. And they did criticize the essay itself as some of the reasons why they didn't want to publish it. But then in the end they said, we've already published enough of that. No, sorry, not this time. And I was surprised because I can't imagine they're overloaded with student articles. Like, I'm sure they're always looking for new pieces. And so I wondered, like, why is it that they rejected it? Was it because they didn't want backlash? Was it actually a bad essay? Or because they didn't want to be seen as Zionist apologists? But I was actually relieved, I think, that it was rejected, because I realised if I had that published in my name up there in student media, I would have received a huge amount of backlash, and that would have been pretty awful and probably not worth it.
We need then to talk about this silencing impact of what's perceived as anti-Semitism, whether it meets definitional qualifications or not. The silencing impact is severe. Can I just ask another question of all of you? And that is that the definition makes a clear distinction between the anti-Semitism that it defines and what it terms criticism of Israel, similar to that level against any other country, which cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. Ken, when you and others were drafting this definition, why did you make this your first exception to the set of illustrations? Because those illustrations, I think, are very, my own view, very useful.
Well, as I explained before, we wanted to again take the temperature, but not to make every criticism of Israel, and to again thinking about things like the Durban Conference and the UN Human Rights Commission. That it was just a question of drafting. It wasn't because we figured sort of something was more important. It was important to put that out before the Israel aspects of it. If it's okay, I'd like to respond a little bit to what both Nell and Mark. So, in terms of the anti-Semitism definitions, to me the Jerusalem Declaration, the Nexus definition, and now the IHRA one, what used to be called the UMC or working definition, all have the core of what anti-Semitism is. Right? It's conspiracy theory about Jews trying to harm non-Jews. And it gives an explanation to what goes wrong in the world, and that's the core of it. There are times where there are things, as what Nell was talking about, holding everybody collectively responsible that shouldn't happen. It doesn't only happen to Jews, maybe more on a campus related to Israel, but we've seen in the U.S., for example, attacks against Asian Americans because people had a president who was talking about the, quote, China virus. So there are times, I run a Center for the Study of Hate, there are times where people will be scapegoated, and it's not just anti-Semitism. There are other times where people try to reduce things into simple things and hold individuals responsible. And that's particularly on a campus why I find very difficult. It's not just this issue. I have in my book, in 2006, I believe, I was talking to students at Barnard, and we were doing a workshop on anti-Semitism over dinner. 11 o'clock at night, a bunch of us are still around talking, and a student says, gee, this is the first time I felt comfortable saying what I really think about Israel. And I was sort of startled by that. And I said, is that just something that happens here, or do you have friends at other campuses where that happens too? And she said, yes. And I said, is it only about Israel? And she said, no. So, to weigh, are you going to have a friendship that's going to be hurt? Are you going to have a grade that you're worried about that's going to be diminished? That to me is the opposite of what a campus should be. And so part of the answer to this, at least on a campus, ought to be administrators and others saying, We're protecting you from being harassed. We're protecting you from being intimidated. We're protecting you from being discriminated against. But if you're spending time and money to come here, you better be prepared to have your thinking shaken up, to be disturbed by ideas. That's why we're here. We want you to be disturbed by ideas to your core, and then think about how you're going to deal with them for the rest of your life when you're not on campus.
Mark, I'm sure you've got comments you'd like to make on this. What's your thinking here?
Yeah, Mark, when Ken sums up the definition as a conspiratorial view of Jews, I would agree with that. But what interests me more is the way, and I don't like this word, but the IHRA definition weaponizes anti-Semitism. I'd love to find a substitute word for weaponization. I think of instrumentalization, which is just as bad. But, the problem is how it plays out in the politics of Jewish life. So when Trump uses, not so subtly, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories around George Soros and turns a blind eye to what many of his followers at demonstrations do as he whips them up into a frenzy, many in the Jewish establishment will turn a blind eye to that because Trump is, in their view, doing good things for Israel. When Bibi Netanyahu curries favour with European political leaders from Poland or Orban in Hungary, even allows them to rewrite the true history of the Holocaust, and they're the ones propagating a conspiratorial view of Jews, George Soros at the centre of everything. Again, the people will turn a blind eye to that, and while at the same time knowing, that a conspiratorial worldview lies at the heart of anti-Semitism. So part of the problem with having a definition is that the definition lays the groundwork for perpetuating this politicization, which I think is happening in a very specific way in Australia, and I'll talk about that. I'll talk about that later. If I can say something though about the double standards you talked about, this differentiation between criticism of Israel and the diaspora, it is true that one finds, and there has always been this visceral, irrational hatred of Israel. I remember when I was a student on campus, debating the Zionism is racism resolution. I was on campus soon after that, but there's always been that visceral hatred of Israel. And the UN has a standing resolution on Israel. It's an imperfect institution. But what ends up happening is that when you have 6 out of the 11 examples in the IHRA definition relating to Israel, it creates a chilling effect and focuses on these double standards, which are often more complex. Israel is part of the West. It sets itself up as the exception in the Middle East. It is armed by America and therefore is treated in a different way. I would much rather be subject to the criticism that Israel receives than to be a black African in a country which is totally ignored when genocides happen and millions of people die in the Congo or in Rwanda. There are problems with these double standards and this focus on Israel, but there is a specific reason I think that one can attribute to the focus on Israel, and I can go into that, but I won't now, that I think gives some rational explanation that makes us uncomfortable, but I don't think should be reduced to anti-Semitism alone, even if it often manifests anti-Semitic attributes.
Thank you, Mark. In some ways it becomes more complex, but let me take it back to you, Nell. Right now, when something happens on campus which we would describe as anti-Semitic, or when there is an attack on a student, when there is a verbal attack, let's say for a moment, and I hope to God that there aren't physical attacks, what's open to you? Where can you go, and what sorts of complaints can you make? Is there a venue for this?
Yeah, there certainly is. I think one of the issues is it worth it? So, for example, I know of a student who wears a kippah, and one time a person who I presume to be of Palestinian descent said to him, "You stole my grandfather's land." And in my mind, that's clearly anti-Semitic. Whether that student felt it was worth making a complaint to the university, I think isn't something entirely different. But you can report an anti-Semitic incident straight to the university. They have a bullying, harassment and discrimination policy, and they have a procedure for misconduct. So you can make a complaint about someone else and that person can be investigated for misconduct with a variety of penalties if they're found to have been guilty of that misconduct. The most obvious example of where I would go would be if you go on the IHRA website, there's a whole page where you can make a complaint of anti-Semitism.
And they manage it for you?
Yeah, from what I understand, they, as the only Jewish student union, they feel responsible for advocating against anti-Semitism and advocating for students who experience anti-Semitism to the union.
Thanks very much. Mark, I recently spotted a T-shirt. I live near University of New South Wales, and I recently spotted a T-shirt on this campus with the slogan, "If you aren't progressive on Palestine, you can't call yourself a progressive." As an academic and a former director of a Jewish Studies Centre, why are you critical of the IHRA definition when students on Australian campuses are somehow crying out for a way to counter this kind of thing? They want, in the way that I think Nell just described, to show that there's a middle way. I can sit with you, I can talk with you. Why are you pigeonholing me? So I'd be very interested to know whether there are concrete examples, you think, of where the definition risks conflating anti-Semitism with legitimate criticism, for example, or raising the Palestinian issue.
Yeah, thanks. Firstly, just a word about universities, because I've spent all my life on campus, and there's a difference between sitting in the tower and being on the lawn. And I've been on the lawn, and that incident that Nell talked about, where somebody goes up to a person wearing a kippah and says, "You stole my grandfather's land," I'd be interested what Nell would think that if they went up to the IHRA's table, which is often festooned with Israeli flags, and said the same thing, whether you would still call that anti-Semitic or just an uncomfortable encounter. Because the campus lawn, as far as I remember as a student, has always been an uncomfortable place. Universities house extreme ideologies. People are full of youthful zest and still believe in kind of the most extreme ideologies, and many of them in between. I think these days people tend to be more indifferent to politics than they were in my day, but I could be nostalgic and romanticising. But we always went in there for the good fight. I think we cut our teeth on the political battles around Zionism and didn't turn to external bodies to intervene, but rather we fought the fight and learned how to debate and defend Israel. And for me, that was in the period of the early settlement movement, in the late 70s and early 80s. The atmosphere now has completely changed, and I think that one of the difficulties I have with the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism is that it does conflate anti-Semitism with certain things that are debatable, and they're uncomfortable. But I think that we're living in a time when Jews have to sit in their discomfort. That doesn't mean that Jews deserve to be beaten physically. That doesn't mean that when Hasidim are beaten in Brooklyn, where Ken is sitting, that in any way is excusable and doesn't constitute anti-Semitism. But I think that there is something uncomfortable for me about the Jewish condition, and where I'm personally torn. I'm a Zionist. I identify strongly with Israel, but I believe that Israel has become an oppressor state. Is it a colonial state? Is it a settler colonial state? People will jump up in the Jewish establishment and say using those words it can be anti-Semitic. I think they're legitimate academic words that can be debated. Herzl himself used the word colonial to describe his enterprise. What about the word apartheid? I'm uncomfortable with the word apartheid, but I've always boycotted the goods in the settlements, and it's exactly what Ben and Jerry's did. Yet immediately when Ben & Jerry's simply boycotted the sale of ice cream in the territories, in occupied territory, they were branded as anti-Semitic. And if IHRA in any way lends itself to that kind of interpretation of what Ben & Jerry's did, it's problematic. But I'd go further and say it's even problematic to brand the use of the word apartheid in relation to Israel. I might personally think that that word is misplaced, but I think it is debatable. Credible organisations within Israel, civil rights organisations, have called Israel apartheid because of what they regard as a segregated policy in the West Bank that defines the whole of Israel at the moment. It doesn't mean that Israel is intrinsically apartheid. It means that there is a debate about how to define what an entrenched occupation has morphed into now. And if that means singling out Israel, if that means applying a definition that is a crime against humanity against Israel, or calling Israel, for example, to the International Criminal Court, the Jewish establishment has jumped up and said, oh, that's anti-Semitic. What they don't realise is that most of the people who've been called to the ICC have been black, have been African countries and not Israel, and yet many believe that Israel has been protected by the shield of many of the Western countries who are its allies, and that there is at least legitimate cause for considering that Israel is guilty of certain crimes of humanity without necessarily saying that because the UN is hypocritical, is imperfect, that we have to do away with the international system which Jews in fact invented post-Holocaust and can be credited for, and that therefore everything just gets reduced to anti-Semitism. I think these are very complex and need to be seen in more nuanced ways, while at the same time protecting Jewish life and Jewish dignity. But Jews have to also protect their own dignity and ask themselves what they own, what we own. Just like I think people in other countries have to ask what they own in terms of what they are implicated in terms of their beliefs and political views.
It's interesting, every time you use the word debatable, you raise for us the fact that for a lot of Jews it's very difficult to find a venue for that debate to take place. And it's extremely important that, in the way that Nell described, that we be able to debate the things that make us uncomfortable without our expressions of discomfort being taken to mean that we are, as one is sometimes tarred, a self-hating Jew. I can be uncomfortable, as Israelis are uncomfortable, whilst loving Israel and being a Zionist and so on. So the idea of debatability, I think, is a really important one. Ken, you know that our Constitution is not at all the Constitution of the US. Nobody knows that better than you do. But our Prime Minister has moved to adopt the definition. It's a very strong and a very clear signal. He's not a man who normally gives clear signals. In fact, he's recently been accused of the very reverse. And that's a first step. What followed adoption in the US? Are there, for instance, programs of community education for both the Jewish and the wider community to understand what this adoption is intended to bring about?
That's a great question. So the first thing is what is meant by adoption. I mean, I've heard lots of places talk about it, adopted in schools in the UK, other places. I'm not quite clear what adoption means. Adoption and applying, and the concern I have is very much like Mark's. I mean, one of the criticisms somebody wrote a book review about my book about the campus debate about this, which had a whole chapter about the definition, was he said basically if you create a manual for hunting witches, don't be surprised if there are people that use it for witch hunts. And that was never the intention, but that's in fact what people are using it for inside and outside the community. It's a symbolic debate. Even people get, which side are you on? And inside the Jewish community and outside the Jewish community. In terms of adoption in the US, what do we mean by that? It really has been adopted by the State Department years ago in ways that I actually commended for discussion of multilateral and bilateral relations like the UN Human Rights Council and other forms, but it hasn't been, adopted broadly. What happened was that back, and just to give you a little bit of background for it, I mean, Mark, my background is working on campus too. I wrote pieces in the early 90s about how not to have hate speech codes. They simplify things. You try to force everything into a discussion of is it inside, is it outside, when you don't look at all the other things that a campus should be doing, curriculum, surveys, and all those other things. So long background to saying a campus ought to be a place where, again, ideas are expressed and people are disturbed. But what happened was in 2010, you had groups on the Jewish right that started filing these civil rights complaints and saying, wait a minute, Jewish students are being discriminated against. Why? Sometimes they talked about things that were actions, which were okay, but then they started talking about classes in terms of what was being assigned, speakers that were coming to campus, and they were alleging, look, there are things that are being said here or that we fear being said, that will be said, that are violative in our view of what the definition is. And all those cases lost. So then they started pushing the Trump administration to have legislation that says when you look at a civil rights complaint on a campus, you have to consider the definition. And the legislation didn't pass. And then Trump made it as part of the executive order. So, that prioritizes a particular definition. If you look at, there's no other group there's a definition. You could see in the U.S., for example, with the backlash to the George Floyd murder and the Black Lives Matter movement, nobody's saying, well, let's have a definition of racism that includes specific examples that are political, like do you oppose affirmative action? Do you oppose Black Lives Matter? Do you oppose leaving up Confederate statues for any reason? That would be seen as trying to restrict the speech. And that's precisely what these groups are trying to do with this. And we've seen other ways where it's impacted in the United States, because you had, when the executive order was signed, Jared Kushner wrote a piece in the New York Times, said, yes, this affirms our policy as the U.S. government that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, full stop. Now, sometimes anti-Zionism can be anti-Semitism, but not full stop, not all the time. There's no nuance there, black or white, right? Then you had Pompeo, the Secretary of State, saying, well, we're going to stop funding groups that promote anti-Semitism using the definition and threaten the funding of Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. And you had in the UK too, the Minister of Education saying that universities had to adopt it, and was certainly coupled with a threat to funding. So that's what we're seeing as the use of the definition, exactly the way Mark warned us, is a problem for the academy and I think for society at large.
Nell, if the university adopted it and simply said it's now part of our bullying and harassment program, would that make it more likely that students would go direct to those people and lodge a complaint? And would you trust them? Are they sophisticated enough to be able to manage a complaint like that? Apparently they take years to resolve other matters.
Look, there's a lot in that question. What would happen if the university codified IHRA? There's a cynic in me that says it would just be virtue signaling, that it really wouldn't make much of a difference. There's a part of me that thinks the universities would be reluctant to adopt a definition that may be used to suppress speech that is complex, that might be unreasonable, but not necessarily constituting of hate speech. So I also think when I looked at IHRA and I looked at what I felt ambivalent about, it was the example of anti-Semitism being that denying the Jewish people a right to self-determination, e.g. by claiming that the state of Israel, the existence of the state of Israel, is a racist endeavor. And I feel ambivalent about that, because if that were to be actually implemented as policy at the university, that sets that could set, depending on how it's interpreted, an incredibly low threshold for anti-Semitic speech. Because most pro-Palestine protests that I've been to, and content written in student media does imply that Israel is a racist endeavour. Does that mean that they should be punished for anti-Semitism? So that's where my discomfort is. In terms of how it would be managed, so misconduct, if someone makes a complaint about another student, that student gets investigated for misconduct. And from what I know, the process can take from several months to up to a year. I know of someone who, after a few different complaints, was expelled from the university after 2 years of an investigation. So incredibly mentally taxing on the individuals being investigated. I think the universities have the capacity to handle these complaints in a sophisticated way. I also feel I think on the one hand, universities do really prioritise free speech on campus and academic freedom and freedom of expression. On the other hand, what we are seeing in Australia is a weakening of university institutions over the last, I'd say, 2 decades of government policies towards unis. And look, I think the last 2 decades, I haven't been around that long, so I can't completely verify. But
we don't believe you, Nell.
But I think, just in the last couple of years, 17,000 jobs were lost, university jobs were lost. I think our research output is going down. I think our academic institutions, I don't think, are as robust as maybe they once were. And that affects everything in university life, from the quality of the education to the management. There's increased casualized workforce, and there's increased managerialism. So I think that would affect the university's capacity to deal with complex controversies around things such as hate speech and anti-Semitism. Also, and I will add, because what I have seen in terms of misconduct proceedings is that they've also been influenced by outside bad faith actors. For instance, 2 girls were being investigated for organising a protest, and a state MP in Parliament spoke about it, and it was shown that he was actually trying to pressure the Vice Chancellor to accelerate those proceedings. And also I've seen the media, other public figures have their say on certain controversies that arise at universities.
And these are not anti-Semitic issues. These are not issues of anti-Semitism. No.
These are different. But if you actually read the rules around misconduct, you could be investigated for misconduct such as prejudicing the university's reputation. It's incredibly deliberately vague and opaque. So, yeah, I feel cynical about their capacity to deal with it in a way that is necessary.
Mark, I wanted to ask you this question before I go to Ken to round us off, and that is, why a special definition for anti-Semitism when for so long what Jewish communities around the world have advocated for is action against racism and to find allies, among whom there will be support for the idea that anti-Semitism is racism, and that we ally together, we find alliances with others in order to create a more inclusive and less uncomfortable climate for us all. Is this special focus on Jews going to backfire?
Right. Well, part of the answer to that is to address the question that you asked, Nell. What would happen if IHRA was adopted on campuses? Because I can tell you what would happen, because I know from experience. It would be used as a basis for external interference. You would immediately have Jewish lobby groups, whether it's AJAC or the Anti-Defamation Commission or the Zionist Federation who would seize upon one of the 6 exceptions and who would go there backing the students and who would make delegations protesting what is happening in curricula, what is happening with particular students. And you would have donors who have very generously given to Jewish studies programs that have allowed them to flourish through campuses in Australia and in the United States and elsewhere, who would also be making phone calls, pressuring these donors and also these Jewish studies centres. I think that's extremely dangerous. I think it's counterproductive because what they would want to see is a particular view of Israel that is taught through the prism of Hasbara. And one thing that I know is that students, Jewish and non-Jewish students, are not stupid. They can see through shallow, non-critical thinking and will never satisfy those on the outside who want to play their politics and bring them into the campus. I think what's important is that students who often do face situations that are anti-Semitic and who face, and sometimes it's hard to distinguish that from situations that are uncomfortable. And it cuts both ways because you often have Jewish studies teachers who are teaching courses on the Middle East, which was the case at Monash, where we were also getting complaints and complaints of bias should be addressed. Students should be taking them up. But what happens is, and it's happened in my experience, you have professional organisations outside who go in there, arm people with tape recorders, and then use the recordings of lectures, either in Jewish studies or in other areas, as ammunition, and then politicians get brought into it. And that's really what's happening in Australia. Scott Morrison sees an opportunity before an election to curry favour with a particular segment of the electorate, and Labor, unfortunately, I think is being dragged into this as well because everyone wants to be seen on the right side, the right, or even on the right side of this issue. And I think it's misguided. It's not that I minimise anti-Semitism. I think it's a serious issue. I think that IHRA does a disservice to it, and those who claim that it's just a guideline rather than something that will be codified aren't listening to what politicians like Tudge are saying, aren't looking at what's happened in America in the way it's used with Title VI, which Ken could elaborate on, aren't seeing what would happen on campuses, aren't seeing what's happening at the ABC at the moment, how the government is doing a full front attack on the ABC that is being pushed by various sectors, not just the Jewish sector, but certainly AJAC is part of that. And there's a push to adopt IHRA because that would give them the ammunition to allow them to constantly claim that there is bias against Israel in every report, and sometimes there is, and they should be called out for that. But Ida Buttrose is right to push back on these kinds of assaults.
Ken, you say that debate over the definition is sucking away the abilities to look at other more comprehensive ways to combat anti-Semitism. To cheer us up, would you tell us perhaps what some of those ways are? Because perhaps having discussed and debated this, we need to move towards some of the effective ways that we can use as lovers of Israel, as committed Jews in these contexts and committed anti-racists to making a change.
Well, thank you for the invitation to end on a positive note. I want to just say one thing that in response to both, or to amplify both what Nell and Mark were saying about academic freedom, that I think you need to, before I go into the good news, one of the things that I think you need is a consistent principle. And I'm disturbed by the academic boycott of Israel. I'm disturbed by, in the U.S., we've had a few occasions where speakers have been shut down who are pro-Israel. There have been some professors who refuse to write letters for students who want to do study abroad in Israel. All that I see is violative of academic freedom. But you don't fight blacklists and things like that with violating academic freedom from the other side. And it troubles me when you try to put it into law, hard law, soft law. You don't do that. What you're supposed to be doing on a campus about any issue of bigotry is enhancing academic freedom. And that's what I will spend a couple of minutes at the final end of my comments to emphasize how to do that on a campus. I think one of the problems that we have about looking at anti-Semitism is that we sort of devolve to what are people saying about Jews. I think that's a much too narrow a lens. Let me give you an example here. Mark had mentioned Trump, and I believe I did too. So there was a debate here about whether Trump was anti-Semitic or not for his campaign ads, for things that he had said. And so it always struck me as that was missing the point. I don't really care if he's an anti-Semite or not. I care that he empowers anti-Semites, that by saying that the people at Charlottesville, some fine people among us. And then if you look at Pittsburgh, Mark mentioned the Tree of Life. What happened there? You had this frenzied thing with Trump talking about invaders coming across the southern border. And you had Bowers saying, oh my God, the synagogue here had a Jewish group that was promoting immigration. I got to stop this. I'm going to act. And he did. Clearly an act of anti-Semitism. A couple of months later, there's somebody that goes and shoots up the Walmart in El Paso, kills Mexicans and Mexican Americans. None of us would call that anti-Semitic. But you look at the ideology that drove both of them, and you look at the rhetoric that propelled both of them, and it was identical. They just chose different targets. So when we look very narrowly, we miss a lot of what propels anti-Semitism. I talked about anti-Semitism as conspiracy theory. So to me, that when things happen in society that promote conspiracy theories, when we promote the capacity of human beings to see an us and a them, and we got to defend ourselves against them that are dangerous, anti-Semitism is inevitably the result. So when I speak to Jewish groups here, I say I'm less concerned with what Trump was saying about Jews and more about what he was saying about Muslims and immigrants. That drove anti-Semitism and its rise. So to me, the other aspects of it are promoting, as Nell was saying, the strength of democracy is important, is essential for fighting bigotry and anti-Semitism. And free speech and those norms have to, free press, judiciary have to be protected. The right to organize. She was talking about the stripping of people on campus. The labor movement's decimation in the U.S., I think, is tied to where people go to vent their frustrations, where they used to go to the labor movement. So there are a lot of different pieces outside of what we traditionally think about anti-Semitism. So let me talk for just a brief second about some of the things that can be done and should be done on campus. I was saying there should be things that promote academic freedom. There need to be more courses on anti-Semitism. When I teach it, by the time we get into Israel and Zionism 2/3 of the way in, everybody can have a reasonable discussion because they coalesce as a group and as an understanding of the history of anti-Semitism. There need to be more classes about free speech and the importance of academic freedom, and to have differences and to have a campus where your ideas are shaken. And I'll give you one final example of a class that I think is really wonderful that somebody put together a few years ago. It was based on the Peel Commission. For those who don't remember, when the Brits had the mandate, they sent Lord Peel to go and talk to everybody and figure out what the heck should we do. And the class, so therefore, looked at the Israel-Palestine conflict from the 1880s until the 1930s. So a stop before the declaration of the state, the Holocaust, contemporary events. And it told the students had to be, for half of the class, to be faithful reenactors of some person who was participating in the Peel Commission. So I talked to a Pakistani Muslim woman who had to spend a number of weeks faithfully representing David Ben-Gurion. And when I talked to her about it, she said, "You think that was weird?" I had an Israeli classmate who had to be the mufti, and as much of a pain in the butt as he was, the person who was the Jabotinsky figure on my side was much more difficult to handle. And the professor said at the end of this, the students came in and said, when we started this class, we thought we would know how Israel and Palestine should have been solved. And now we know 80 years later why it still hasn't been solved. And that to me is the point of education, and to use education to enlighten on these issues, not to have de facto rules that define good and bad and who should be shut up and who should be venerated.
Ken and Mark and Nell, I think you've given us a picture that I would sum up by saying that there is complexity in this at a level that can't simply be defined away, and that we need to work hard and harder to combat what we see as racism of all sorts. And I'm particularly moved, Ken, by what you've said at the end, that in the absence of labour movement organisation, in the absence of courses of the sort that Mark was responsible for. In the absence of the kind of supports that Nell has found wanting on campus, we are fighting in a very narrow field where we should be widening that field. And I thank you all very, very much for your input today. It's been this evening, it's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. I'll hand to
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jo, for leading that discussion, and thank you to Ken, Nell and Mark for joining us tonight and helping us to understand better this debate, what the concerns are about how the definition might be used and where we go from here in order to get down to the real work, the best way to fight and combat anti-Semitism. We're going to put some resources up on our website. You can follow the link that's now on your screen to read more and also to watch this event back and to share it with your friends. What we do have coming up next is a great event with NIF's global CEO, Daniel Sokach, as we launch his debut book, Can We Talk About Israel? A really incredible read, a great resource for all of us. So watch your inbox later in the week for more details on that. Thank you again to the big crowd, more than 300 people who signed up to join us tonight. Stay safe and see you all soon. Have a good night.